This is Addison Shonland, and my guest again, Sean Mendes. Hi there, Sean. How are you?
I'm wonderful, Addison.
Thank you for being with me today and having another chat about the African commercial aviation space. The big news, I think everybody would agree this week, is the situation at South African Airways. How does one understand what is going on there? The state is back in business, owning the airline. Takatso fell apart. Is it political? Where does one go with this?
Well, that is a 54 billion rand question, isn't it?
54 billion rand used to be money.
54 billion, a billion here, a billion there. Soon enough, you're talking about some real cash.
Right.
But, you say that the government is back in business. I'm going to say the government never stopped being in the airline business. Okay. Everything that South African Airways and the South African DP, the Department of Public Enterprises, has done over the last 5 years since putting the airline into business rescue in late 2019 has basically been focused on remaking the airline in the vision of what the ANC wanted that airline to be, which is an instrument of the state, instrument of state policy, effectively, whether that policy is going to be, demographic transformation of the workforce, whether that's going to be flying that airline to places where the South African government wants to use it as an instrument of foreign policy or whatever. I've always been skeptical about the little fig leaf of we're going to sell part of this airline to a private entity, because the Takatso consortium was nominally private, but in reality it wasn't. Because if you look at the structure of that Takatso consortium to begin with, the majority stake in Takatso initially was being held by Harith Global Partners. And Harith, in turn, is an infrastructure fund who's controlling, or at least, if not controlling, at least the majority shareholder is the government investment fund. So the reality is the funds that were coming back into South African Airways as private funds were actually government funds through a series of, investment corporations and trusts and consortiums and so forth. When the Competition Commission ruled that the transaction could not go forward unless the truly independent players in the deal, which was Global, which are the parent company of Lyft, the other domestic airline in the South African market, unless Global exited. I think at that point it became very clear that this transaction was going to be doomed to failure. It was just a case of figuring out the right excuses. And I think the final excuses came about when the government, strangely enough, rather than just being grateful that anyone was willing to even give them the 51 Rand sale price that had been negotiated, because quite honestly, South African Airways in its current avatar isn't worth 51 Rand. But yes, the government decided that no, we must now try and renegotiate the sale price. And following the very, very, very damning Auditor General report, that has come to light this month, the Auditor General who's audited the accounts of South African Airways has placed a disclaimer stating that, and I'll give you the quote over here, "We are unable to express an opinion on these audits due to inadequate record keeping, misstatements, and a lack of critical skills and capacity at South African Airways to prepare credible financial statements." That basically translates to these people have no clue whether they are making money, losing money, or whatever else. They have also outlined that irregular expenditure increased up to 44.5 billion Rand over 4 years. That's $2.5 billion US. And fruitless and wasteful expenditure increased to $11 million over the last 4 years. There also, the government has claimed that this is now a profitable, independent airline. However, despite all their claims that they've only put, $150 million or something into the airline, the actual auditor and the financial reports state that 27.6 billion Rand, or that's about $1.5 billion US, have been given to this airline since it exited business rescue. So, I mean,
yeah,
this airline has just, no matter what they may stand up and claim, the numbers just simply do not lie. It is a absolute black hole where money goes to die. And the government, by pretending that this is a viable entity, has made it very clear that they're being absolute ostriches, sticking their head in the ground and pretending that everything is good while they sing Kumbaya as roam birds around them. And sorry for mixing the metaphors.
Well, the thing that's interesting about this is, let's say that the state is in La La Land, as they seem to be with, you know, the state capture, which is the South Africa brought the word felt to the language of the world. Now the next thing they brought is state capture. I think that was another term that has not existed anywhere else. So the thing that's interesting about this, of course, is that you've got this quasi state-owned entity competing with private capital in the market, Safair and Airlink and Semair. And those companies are run on capitalist approaches, right? They have to find money from the markets and banks and have to make a profit and pay back all that finance and to make a living, so to speak. Having a state-supported entity like SAA can only disturb the market incredibly.
I think that summarizes the reason why governments should not be involved in businesses where the private sector is competing with them. And that's not just in aviation. I think it goes across all sectors, especially when the government airline has shown itself to be completely, well, if not completely, but for the most part, completely incapable of making a profit. I mean, South African Airways has not been profitable in the competitive environment ever. It has been, profitable where it's had monopolies or, in little black swan events like the FIFA World Cup or whatever else. And, these kind of things, anything could make a profit. Literally a flying cockroach with seats strapped on the back could make a profit when you're the only player in the market. And we've seen consistently how South African Airways' market share in 1992, South African Airways had well over 50% of the international market to and from South Africa. That number down in 2019, I think, was below 20%. It's really shown that South African Airways has shrunk from being the dominant player to becoming basically an also-ran or an irrelevance in that market.
Right.
And so while South African Airways continues to be an enigma in terms that it's incapable of supporting itself profitably, I think its footprint and the damage it can cause to the actual market dynamics has significantly reduced as a result of that. It's got 7 planes now. Safair's got 3 times that many, or maybe 4 times as many right now. And, Airlink is 60 plus. So, South African Airways really is an also-ran in this market. The market has progressed without them. And yes, they can cause damage to it. And, they may, sell at unviable prices that the competitors may have to match. But the fact is their footprint in the domestic market, for example, is Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, and Kaapstad. And, they're OPE, in case I pronounced that wrong. There's a much larger market. There's Bloemfontein, East London, George, and everywhere else where the Airlinks and these, Semairs and the Safairs are eating their lunch. So South African Airways has become an irrelevance. They've got to build themselves back into relevance, and there's no way they're going to do that with the lack of access to capital they have without a private partner and without the government continuing to fund them ad infinitum. And I don't think there is a political appetite for the government to keep doing that, especially with the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, having announced his retirement from politics at the end of the next election. So come June, there will be a new, minister in charge of DPE, and I think the government's position on SAA will definitively change from what it is right now. Now, whether it changes for the better or worse, we'll find out depending on who's appointed. But status quo is only status quo until June, and after that.
Right. I found it interesting. There was an interview with John Lamola, the South African Airways CEO, where he said that they were going to grow the fleet and that people were standing in line to lease them airplanes. I found that to be a very amusing statement because given the state of affairs and the financial risk in dealing with the airline, standing in line to run sounds to me more like the approach of any rational lessor.
Well, he's right in some respects. Yes, a lot of people are willing to deal with South African Airways, but are not willing to deal with South African Airways on market competitive terms. I mean, without going into specifics, I've spoken and worked with some leasing companies who've looked at risks of dealing with South African Airways. But South African Airways' terms for a lot of the leases, and this is public information that they put out in their their RFPs and similar, has been that they do not want to put any deposits down on aircraft. So effectively, they're willing to pay almost double market rates to dry lease or wet lease an aircraft because they don't have the cash upfront to put a deposit. So they'll pay more out of cash flow to not have to put in cash. And that's a great deal when you've got the government as a shareholder and double market rates. As a lessor, if you've got a distressed asset, heck, put it with them for a few months, wait till they default and take it back. No harm, and you've just made a lot of cash for the few months. So it's not incorrect that there are people who are ready to do business with them, but are people ready to do business with them on commercial terms? Well, the answer to that is a flat out no, for the same reason, because the commercial terms where you're willing to put in deposits, when you're willing to make guarantees and things like that, SAA simply has not been able to do that for the last few years. And as a result, they've become this little unicorn. It's a very unique kind of entity that claims to be making money while the accounts actually tell a very different story. Fictional.
Okay, so let's go to another an airline in that market, Safair, Fly Safair. There's been all kinds of rumbles about ownership. The competitors to Fly Safair obviously are pointing to the fact that the control of the airline may not be South African based, which of course is what the law requires. What do you see going on there?
It's a complex situation, and the ownership structure of Safair has been complex as long as Safair has existed. And they've tried to make it as opaque as possible. Back in the in the old days, that was intentional, given what Safair's origins were in terms of the kind of missions and
Sure.
operations it performed back in the pre-92 days. But subsequent to that, as Safair has come into commercial scheduled operations, I think, we went through this, must have been 10, 11 years ago. I think about 2013, 2014, when Safair first applied for their, with the Air Service Licensing Commission for their license. They were initially denied. There was an issue with their ownership structure at that time. And in order to comply with the requirements in terms of maximum, I think it's 25% foreign ownership and a majority of control has to be vested with South African residents as well. It's not just citizens, but it has to be South African residents. So they have to be domiciled within South Africa is what the regulation requires. And because of that, I believe, they came up with a couple of creative solutions. I'm not quite sure I remember all of it, and I'm not sure all of it was even made public, but they transferred a big chunk of the shareholding into a South African trust. And also 25% of the shareholding was transferred into employee ownership. So that just left 25% of the outstanding shares actually owned by their foreign shareholders, which has now morphed into ASL Group, which is obviously a European entity. Now, a few years ago, pre-COVID, pre-SAA divorce with Airlink and everything, there had been rumbles. In fact, there had been a tentative agreement, I believe, for Safair and Airlink to I believe it's actually planned to be a merger. Yeah, it was going to be a full-blown merger. And as part of their steps towards actualizing this merger, obviously they had to unwind some of these trusts and employee ownership and things like that, which which had been put in place in order to comply with the ownership and control requirements back in 2014. So I think at that time, some steps were taken which may have put them out of compliance temporarily. And obviously the deal with Airlink did not go through in the end. And I think what Roger Foster at Airlink has said publicly is he's not made a complaint. He simply asked the Air Service Licensing Council to have a look whether SAFAIR has taken the appropriate steps to rewind what they had unwound.
Right.
They were compliant. They took steps to put them out of compliance in anticipation of the merger. Merger did not go through. He's just asking, have they gone back to what was compliant earlier? So Roger is very clear. He's not made a formal complaint. SAFAIR is very clear that, without giving specifics, that they have taken the necessary steps to remain in compliance. Air Service Licensing Council has not denied them renewal of licenses or additional licenses or whatever on this ground. So I think this is just a bit of make sure everybody's just dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and I don't anticipate too much will come of it. And to be perfectly honest, even if there was some fire behind that smoke, I cannot see the Air Service Licensing Council in today's world, where FlySAFAIR provides so much of domestic capacity in South African market that has still not fully rebounded to its pre-COVID numbers. I cannot see them shutting down. South African CA and South African bureaucracy has done a lot of stupid things in aviation over the years, but I think this might be even one step too far from them, especially with an election coming up and due, in the near future. So I think it would be more of a case that even if they were not in compliance, they give them a window to come into compliance rather than just, give them an overnight shutdown like SACA has tended to do with some of their less favored airlines in the past.
Right. We have two more, two quick items I wanted to ask you about. Gabon looks like, as you eloquently described, state ownership, but Gabon looks like they want to start another airline or restart, or I don't know what one calls this thing. Is it a phoenix or some other kind of bird?
Well, you want to look at the political situation in Gabon. There is a new administration there which has come about due to a military intervention, and consequently, the junta or the Liberation Council or whatever they're calling themselves needs to stamp their authority over things. And one thing that they say every African country, when it's trying to reinvent itself, needs a flag, an anthem, and an airline. So they've got a flag, they've got an anthem, and now the third thing to build up nationalistic sentiment is an airline. To my credit, though, I'll say that rather than try to start a new airline from scratch, they've looked at a private airline operating in Gabon, which is AfriJet. And the government of Gabon has announced just last week that they are going to purchase 56% of the holding company behind AfriJet, and then use AfriJet's air operator certificate to set up a new brand called Fly Gabon, which will become an airline that now competes against AfriJet, which the government also owns. And to this end, they have, presumably with very generous French export financing that comes together with, I'm sure, some sort of military troop base agreement or whatever else in the back rooms, they've agreed to purchase 2 ATRs from Toulouse. And, the minister very proudly made this announcement on one of his freebie junkets into France. And, it's the typical story of an airline in every former French colony. Go to France, get some export funding, give the French a military base, go smile, take delivery of the plane, fail in 5 years' time, lather, rinse, repeat. So I don't expect much to come of this. My only hope is that they don't drag AfriJet down with it.
That's funny. Okay, my last question is Chinese traffic into Africa, freight and passenger traffic. That sparked a bit of news that I saw this last few weeks. What is happening there? Is there an increase in traffic?
That is a fascinating question, because the dynamics of the China-Africa market, it's something that I've personally been very closely involved with, because obviously I had, as you probably know, I set up Africa World Airlines in Ghana in 2010, which was in partnership with Hainan Airlines and HNA Group in China. So seeing how that market dynamics have evolved over the last 20 years has been fascinating. And if you look at Africa-China traffic, say starting in the mid-2000s, around 2005 or so, it was negligible. The isolated Africans went to China, isolated Chinese came to Africa, but it really started exploding in the latter half of the first decade of this century. And I think it grew something in the range of 10,000% over 15 years. So between 2005 and 2019, that market absolutely exploded. And everyone, I mean, it was not just in aviation. Aviation was just a facilitator, but Chinese investment in Africa, Africa's trade links with China, aid, loans, everything. The economic entanglement of China and Africa was defining what they call the new African century. So by the time 2019 came about and COVID hit, China was really in an important position with regards to Africa and an aviation. Then China remained closed for almost 4 years. And, Africa also closed down. I think 2020, Africa was really closed. 21, Africa began to sort of limp back to normality. But Africa has been open for business in 22 and 23. Now, if you look at 2019 as a baseline, that was the absolute apex of China-Africa traffic. Those numbers went down to virtually zero in 2020, slight growth in 21. 22 and 23 still were very well below. By well below, I'm talking about like 60 to 70% below those 2019 peaks. Now, Africa was back to business in 22 and 23, but these people, the African traders, could not be traveling into China. And consequently, we saw in 22 and 23 a growth in potential proxy markets for China. And these were notably in the Middle East and India. So effectively, the traders who used to be, going to Guangzhou to do the deals to import, I don't know, plastic buckets or whatever else they were importing from China, were now doing those deals in Dubai or in Doha or in Mumbai or wherever else. Some of it may have been replacement for Chinese goods, maybe with an Indian manufacturer instead. Some of it may have been just dealing with the Chinese, in a midpoint in one of the, the traditional bazaars of the world, so to speak, rather than going all the way to China themselves. Now, China itself just opened up completely for business in mid-23. Since then, we've seen a very strong growth in the second half of 23, although we're still not quite back up to those 2019 numbers. But for summer of 2024, in fact, during the month of March 2024, I read this fascinating statistic that there are actually more direct flights between China and Africa than there are between China and the United States. And given the fact that the China-Africa market is still significantly lagging where it was at its absolute apex in 2019, I think it's very clear that both the Chinese and the African airlines are doubling down on their bets that this market is going to recover to the absolute, to the high-flying growth that it once saw and to the high-flying market leadership that it once had. And this is not just passengers. I think on the cargo side, those ties are probably stronger because those ties continued even during COVID. It's just that having more passenger flights into there with wide-body aircraft and belly cargo and so forth just gives you far more options to do it. And if you look at airlines like Ethiopian, they're opening out cargo routes to destinations in China that I hadn't even heard of before. I think they started one to a city called Yichuan or something like that. And genuinely, I had to Google it to see, is this actually a real place and where is it? And so, there are a lot of secondary cities in China which have these direct flights to Africa now, mainly pushing cargo. But, the cargo is there because that's a manufacturing center. And obviously, if there's a manufacturing center, there's an importer and an exporter involved in it, and they're going to be traveling there. So I think certainly the market will bounce back. The only question is how quickly it will bounce back and whether some of that traffic that was lost to the Middle East and India is going to be a permanent replacement for China, or whether that is something that's going to rebound into China during 2024 and beyond.
Very good summary. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.